It's The World This Week, 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. With us, Elaine Cobb, Paris correspondent for CBS News.
Good evening.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. The rugby is on and Ireland will win.
Ireland will win, okay. Marc Basset's Paris correspondent for Spanish broadsheet of record El País. How are you?
Good, thank you.
All right. With us as well, Alexis Poulain, co-founder of the news website The Modern World, Le Monde Moderne. How are you?
Good, thank you.
And we're joined by Judah Grunstein, editor-in-chief of World Politics Review. Where does one find World Politics Review?
Always open with the tough questions, Francois. It's worldpoliticsreview.com.
The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter, #WorldThisWeek. Nicolas Maduro has seen off many a challenge since he succeeded the late Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. But we're definitely now in uncharted territory, what with the self-proclaimed rival president openly courting the military.
What role do the armed forces play, for example? We've spoken of the amnesty guarantees that have been given, but the armed forces also have a role in the reconstruction of the country. Citizen security, to stabilize the borders, all of us have a role at this moment.
All right, so both Maduro and Guaido trying to win over the military. It's been 10 days since there was that demonstration in Caracas, Marc Basset's, where the Speaker of Parliament swore himself in as acting president. And we seem to still be in this kind of observation phase with the tension mounting.
Yes, the tension mounting and international players stepping in a way. And we are seeing a kind of, if you allow me, a kind of Cold War revisited in the Americas with superpowers like the United States.
Because when we speak to our correspondent in Caracas, she says, in Venezuela itself, if you're with the opposition, this is a domestic matter. If you're on the side of Maduro, you're seeing it as foreign players interfering.
Yes, probably, and we have to say that I suppose that Maduro plays the argument that Trump is against me, but it's not only Trump, as we've seen. It's Canada, it's the European Union, I can speak for Spain, the socialist center-left government of Spain. So it's not a question of right versus left. Who now dares to say that Maduro is progressive, or a leftist leader.
It's also the Lima Group, which is a grouping of South American countries as well as Canada and Mexico.
Although Mexico itself is saying they're not getting involved.
They're not getting involved, but the other members of the Lima Group and the Organization of American States has come down on the side of the opposition. It's important to remember, too, that the crisis itself is an international crisis. Particularly in South America, there are 2 or 3 million Venezuelan refugees and asylum seekers that have spread out through the continent. And that's reached a tipping point in the last few months where, after an initial very warm welcome, because of the region's experience with exile and asylum, each country has its own experience with that. And Venezuela was usually a welcoming country for other countries' asylum seekers. So there was an initial period of welcoming them. That's now turned in terms of public opinion. There have been some crimes that have been committed. There's economic competition, things like that. So the other governments in the region are feeling a huge amount of pressure as well. And with regard to the military, this is the period in this kind of challenge where people are weighing their bets. They're weighing their next steps.
Still the observation rounds.
Either decision at this point could be fatal. If anyone in the military openly comes out in favor of the opposition and the opposition fails, it's a fatal decision. If they decide to stay loyal to the regime and the opposition succeeds, they won't benefit from the amnesty or any sort of tolerant policy after the.
At the start of the week, the Pope returned from Latin America, and they asked him what he feared most. He said a bloodbath when it comes to Venezuela.
Not impossible, it all remains to be seen, because when you've got that kind of power play where you have a president who's not moving and someone who claims to be president and the military waiting in the wings, and let's not forget huge social inequality and poverty in the country. And Venezuela still has the most confirmed oil resources in the world. It is a rich country, but poor management for years has led to terrible social inequality. I mean, violent crime in Caracas is not new. It's been going on since the 80s and 90s. And all of that is building into the kind of dissatisfaction that is fueling what's happening now.
Venezuela's government couching the showdown in simple terms. It's a slow coup perpetrated by the United States. Supporters at a pro-Maduro rally that had state oil company employees from PDVSA suggested that much. They are denouncing those plans by Washington to funnel oil payments by the U.S. to Guaido.
Get your hands off our oil industry, you Yankees. You won't rule Venezuela again, and you won't take our oil away.
You talk about Venezuela here in France, and it's the old left versus right dichotomy that rears its head at Ixipura.
We said it. It's Cold War material. You have on one side the Russian, the Chinese, who invested billions to get the oil, and they're getting the oil. And on the other side, you have the Americans, who have been refining the Venezuelan oil for years, and even Goldman Sachs, who bought some bonds of the PDVSA in 2017, making huge profit. And if you look on the markets, this socialist regime is playing the game. They have been paying them their debts, and the debts is a cool product because it's very cheap and you make a good return on investment. What happened now could have happened years before. It's a game of play about the oil, the gold as well. Remember the bank.
So it is about the oil in your view?
Of course, it's about the resource and seeing what can be bought and how we get there. If you look at the American move, it's clearly to get Citgo to get the company under pressure and saying you won't get the money from the refinery anymore, because the problem with this regime has been not investing enough on the oil or trying to be really independent. It is dependent from the world in terms of market, buying the money, it needs dollars in terms of the oil and in terms of import. And what we have here, don't forget that when we had Swiss leak in 2015, Venezuela was the third country to be mentioned in the affair, and the regime was hiding money in Swiss with HSBC and in fiscal paradise for years. Over 1,000 people, even people fled from the oil company. The finance minister was in there. So this is a corrupt regime that we have. You have 2 million people who signed a petition to get Maduro out before the election. Of course, the problem is you can't just play with a country like this and go to civil war. There must be election again, but not the army playing one side or the other and the guns getting out.
So there are a couple elements I think that change it from just a right-left or a Cold War dynamic, and one of them you mentioned, which is just the massive corruption of the Maduro regime, and before him the Chavez regime.
There's also the stakes that both Elaine and Alexis talk about, which is oil. There's
an economic state for sure, but again, Venezuela, like a lot of South American and Latin American countries, it's a state oil company. No one's going to expropriate the oil. It's a question of who's going to make money off it, for sure.
Exactly.
But there is this question of massive corruption. The second is that the crisis within Venezuela is much more than a political crisis or even an economic crisis. It's a humanitarian crisis. There's a shortage of everything from medicine to food. The average Venezuelan has lost, 10, 15 pounds in terms of body weight because of malnutrition over the last few years. And so whatever flaws he had, Hugo Chavez, when he was president, he had a lot of flaws. He had a slide towards anti-democratic behavior, but it was still a managed democracy. He still had a lot of support among the core supporters.
It was nothing compared
and
to
he also had policies that helped the people who were the worst sufferers of the social inequality. Maduro is just simply a dictator at this point who has overseen a collapse of the economy that has created a humanitarian nightmare for the Venezuelan people. Now, again, the U.S. and outside actors, for sure, the U.S. has been involved. It seems it seems very unlikely that it wasn't coordinated in terms of the rise of Guaido at the end of December, the beginning of January. At the same time, I think the point at which one could defend Maduro or defend the regime because it's a socialist regime against the capitalist Americans, I don't think that prism works anymore. The humanitarian suffering has reached a point where, in any other context, we would be calling for a humanitarian intervention by the United Nations.
The U.S. president saying that all options are on the table. Military intervention in Venezuela by the U.S. not imminent. Earlier said John Bolton, the same White House National Security Advisor, who made a lot of folks either excited or very nervous, depending on your political inclination, with that memo that wrote 5,000 troops to Colombia. Mark Bassett's, what have you made of that? Is that that yellow pad paper?
Well, he was trying to send a message. And
you think that was on purpose by him?
I don't know for sure, but it looks as if it was on purpose. And in any case, all the media jumped into it. But for me, in my opinion, Donald Trump is the big question mark. Nobody can know how he will act in any situation with the shutdown in the America inner politics or in foreign policy. So, and a lot of American presidents wanted to have their own little war. What about Trump, who has this nationalistic, aggressive rhetoric, at the same time isolationist rhetoric? But it's a big question mark in this crisis, and I think that the Europeans should take a prominent role in this issue in order not to let Trump to guide everything.
You talk about the Europeans. Let's talk about it. Yeah. The EU has given Maduro a Saturday deadline for calling early elections. Otherwise, they may also recognize Guaido as the acting president. On the Spanish Prime Minister's tour of Latin America, Pedro Sanchez had to respond when his host, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, explained that Mexico respects the sovereignty of fellow nations.
The Spanish government doesn't want to remove or establish governments. What the Spanish government wants is that through democratic methods, with fair and transparent elections, the Venezuelan society finds a way out of the crisis it's been living in for so many years.
I don't quite get what he's saying there, because he's saying, we want Venezuela to be respectful and all that, but at the same time, he's saying, come this weekend, Spain and the EU may be recognizing Guaido, so they are pushing regime change.
Yes, but they don't want to say how could we say the R word? The regime change word is a doomed word.
How did Sanchez handle himself in Mexico in the company of AMLO?
Well, I think Sanchez is trying to keep an equilibrium, between a position in support of Guaido and a position that takes step by step, not being too aggressive, and trying also to bring all the European Union into this issue.
He said he had more consensus among European leaders than he did with the political parties back in Spain.
It's an issue in Spain. It's political boxing in Spain, Venezuela right now. According to where you are in the political spectrum, you are for one side or for the other. So the right-wing parties are criticizing in very severe terms Sanchez for his too timid position on Venezuela. They would like him to be more aligned with Donald Trump, calling in a more clear way and acting in a more clear way for regime change in Venezuela.
The distinction between the European position and the American position is that the Europeans had a condition for a democratic election before saying that they would then support the opposition. The second thing is that Guaido came out of nowhere. No one knew who he was even a month ago. So there's no guarantee he would win a democratic election. What we do know is that the opposition won the parliament in the last democratic elections that were held, after which Maduro removed power from the parliament with the help of the court system and installed a constituent assembly. So there's clearly a majority support for the opposition over the Chavez regime. Whether or not an opposition candidate would win a presidential election is not certain, even under fair conditions, because the opposition has always historically been divided, and there's never been a figure to rise above those divisions.
Lots of reactions on the hashtag world this week. One clearly in favor of Maduro, saying there's one president in Venezuela, the U.S.-backed imposter, is relying on starvation by U.S. sanctions to force the military to change sides. Which does the U.S. care more about, the Venezuelan people or the oil?
The U.S. sanctions did not cause the starvation. The economic collapse long preceded the starvation. That's a propaganda point that has to be debunked because it's not true. The U.S. sanctions targeted a very small amount of regime insiders. It had nothing to do with the economic collapse of Venezuela.
Aline Cobb, the EU, is it right to, in effect, it's come this weekend, unless Maduro calls those early elections, will also be recognizing Guaido as the acting president?
Well, it's nuanced, and I think it is important to remember that there is still a sitting president and there is an opposition self-declared. And so can Europe just turn around and say, OK, we accept that, and then you have to accept it everywhere it happens? So calling for an election is, if you will, the most reasoned and logical thing to do. Whether or not it will produce the kind of result people might want is, of course, another thing. But it's hard, particularly on this side of the world, to decide, should we be doing that? And, you know, trying to throw its lot in with President Trump is not necessarily a good thing because, as you say, he is unpredictable. Do you really want to say, yeah, we'll go where you go? Where are we going?
And the divisions we witnessed in Spain, we're also witnessing them in France.
This is true. It's coming across Europe divisions across Europe are happening a lot with various issues and depending on internal politics as well. So,
all right, speaking of European divisions, when we come back, we'll be taking a look at the week in Brexit. And it was a tumultuous one. Stay with us. You're watching The World This Week. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. With us, Aline Cobb, Paris correspondent for CBS News. Also with us, Marc Bassets, Paris correspondent for Spanish daily newspaper El País. Alexis Poulain, co-founder of the news website The Modern World, Le Monde Moderne. And Judah Grunstein, editor-in-chief of World Politics Review. Now, this was billed as the week when the UK finally gave a clear indication of what it really wants. After the humiliating rejection of her divorce deal, Theresa May rallying both her Conservative Party and the Northern Irish DUP behind a plan to renegotiate terms with Brussels and to keep that land border with Ireland open at all costs. Now, the very same evening, MPs also approving a motion that rejects a no-deal Brexit. AFP Brussels correspondent Dave Clark summed it up in a tweet. British Parliament votes against no deal and against a deal. Marc Bassets, do you understand what happened on Tuesday in the House of Commons?
Well, not just on Tuesday. You know, all these stories is getting very difficult to understand. But I think that the British and especially Theresa May, they are playing the game of chicken, as it's said, until the deadline of their Brexit. And there is a lot of confusion to be seen in the next 4 weeks, I suspect.
All right, and if we invited Dublin native Aline Cobb, it can only be for one reason, to talk about Gibraltar. There's this whole spat now because the European Council this Friday put out a statement saying Gibraltar is a colony of the British Crown. There is a controversy between Spain and the United Kingdom concerning the sovereignty over Gibraltar, a territory for which a solution has to be reached in light of the relevant resolutions and decisions of the United Nations. Rejection swift on the part of London. Gibraltar is not a colony and it is completely inappropriate to describe it this way. Gibraltar is a full part of the UK family. Its status was changed in 1972.
Yeah, but Gibraltar, interestingly, with the whole Brexit thing, early on, they concluded a deal. The Spaniards were all happy. Everyone said, yeah, that's fine, no problem. And then when they looked at what was happening with the withdrawal agreement, that divorce deal, for Northern Ireland, which had to happen, Gibraltar came back and went, no, wait a minute, not so sure anymore. So, they just copied us on that one.
Is this a big deal, this arguing over Gibraltar, whether it's a colony or not?
No. It is for Spain, obviously, but you know,
It could be a taste of things
It's
to
less
come,
of
right?
interest in Ireland
Because
at the
you're
moment.
going to have, if they're going to try to rehash the Irish backstop, people are saying, oh, well, let's talk fishing rights. Let's talk Gibraltar again.
When you're negotiating, there are a couple sort of golden rules of negotiating. Nothing's agreed until everything's agreed. So if you make concessions early, later on, if one of the concessions is walked back, then you have to change the whole deal. And the second, which is a classic negotiating tactic, is when you're negotiating with someone, you think you got a deal, and they say, okay, let me check with the person who makes the decision. And you thought you were negotiating with someone who could make the decision, but all of a sudden it turns out that you can't. And then they come back and they say, well, I'd love to give you what we agreed on, but I can't. So it seems like both sides are doing the first one. Nothing's agreed. Yeah, they're both trying to. UK is trying to change the deal, so the EU says, "Okay, well, if we're going to change that part of the deal, then we'll have to change other parts of the deal also." And Theresa May is very clearly trying to play the one of, "Well, I'd love to give you what we agreed on, but I'm not the one who makes the decision." And I think what has been most shocking is that usually the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom makes the decision. And in this case, she doesn't have a majority, and she doesn't have control of even her minority government. And that's what's been so shocking.
All right. But if you hear it spun by her own cabinet, it's all part of a secret plan. The negotiations are not over, especially when it comes to, and this was the wording in that resolution about reviewing the Irish backstop, calling for alternative arrangements.
Northern Ireland and Ireland.
Our commitment to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement is absolute. We don't want to outline the precise details in public, because if we do that, they will be rejected in public, because this is a negotiation. So we need to sit down calmly with our friends in the EU and say, look, there is a way forward. We want to show you how this can work. It will address any concerns you have about the border in Northern Ireland, because we share those concerns. And this is the way that we avoid that no-deal scenario.
Are you reassured that Alexis Poulain, there is a plan? It's just they can't talk about the details in public.
No, it looks like Disney's snake, in Jungle Book. Like, believe me, it's gonna work.
They've had 2 years to talk about that plan, if it was there. And when he says that their commitment to the Irish peace deal is absolute, that is complete and utter nonsense, and has been shown over the past 2 years.
The problem with Brexit is that it was a political vote inside the Tory party, inside the Conservative party. There was nothing to do about leaving the EU. There is no plan. It was not thought about. And now you got this vote with a referendum on a too difficult issue. It's too technical. I mean, you can't just, with a magical wand, mend the border or renegotiate.
Is it as
years
binary?
of treaties.
Elaine, is it as binary as it seems? Is it either a choice between respect the will of the people when it comes to Brexit, or respect the 1998 peace deal that ended the troubles in Northern Ireland?
It kind of is, because the peace deal cannot be just set aside because they feel like it. It was signed by Britain and by Ireland. It was underwritten by the EU, which is why the EU is sticking to it and saying, no, you can't. Ireland has already compromised a lot over the past 2 years of negotiations on what exactly will happen. Because let's not forget, it's not just about policing the border. The border really doesn't exist at the moment because there's so much cross-border business cooperation. There are bodies that work on both sides of the border with no difference. And it's not just about trade either. It is about peace. If there is a hard Brexit and there is a return to some kind of border, they're effectively saying, peace deal, torn up, thrown away. And there are a lot of people who will just go straight back to violence. There were bombs in Derry 2 weeks ago, which was just to say, you know what, it's not over. And it will be war.
The shocking thing is how everyone has realized that all their strategies amount to nothing. So on the EU side, it's been this 2-year process of saying, no, nothing you offer will make us give up this red line. We will not have a border between Ireland and Northern Ireland.
But the red line was set by Britain, let's not forget.
But having held firm on that, all of a sudden we're getting closer and closer to a no deal which will put a hard border on between those two. So it's funny the way, or funny, it's tragic the way in which everyone's negotiating themselves in a corner. I will say I'm going to try the secret plan technique with a Maserati dealer. I've got a secret plan to pay you if you let me walk off the lot with one.
And look, there's less now than 2 months until the UK is scheduled to exit the EU. And for the very first time, the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition sat down together one-on-one. It happened Wednesday in the Parliament building.
She listened. I listened to her replies, of course, and we then discussed various issues surrounding the problems of the backstop, which she is going to talk to the EU about. And I pointed out that this would be the first time in British history we'd entered into an arrangement with treaty arrangement with anybody else in which there was no right to leave, because it would be a decision could be made only by the other side.
Does it sound like he's in favor of reviewing the backstop there? I don't understand what he means.
I think he might be hedging his bets. Jeremy Corbyn has a future to look forward to himself. But there's a growing suggestion in Britain that perhaps it's time for Theresa May to say goodbye to the DUP, who she brought on board to win that election that she went back to the people to get a greater majority. That didn't do so well. And they've been holding the British government to ransom. They really have. And I don't think Theresa May fully understood just how powerful and how determined they could be. But there is a lot of suggestion that maybe it's time to say goodbye to that, just to accept that the border should be on the Irish Sea, which of course will then lead Scotland to go, wait now, if Northern Ireland is allowed to stay in the EU, what about us? But it would make the most sense for allowing a Brexit. Let's face it, the majority, 6 out of 10 Britons say, we don't really care if Northern Ireland stays in the EU, according to one poll. And others say, we really don't care that much about the peace deal either. So they really are not that interested in Ireland. They would really like it to go away. And if she had any sense, she would just let it go.
The other irony is that the backstop only kicks in the event that they don't reach a deal. And that
on
will
trade.
On trade and the UK's status in terms of trading with the EU. That will be a little problematic in terms of again balancing the will of the people with a practical solution. But the backstop controversy, or the backstop the sticking point, is a hypothetical one until the 2-year negotiating period runs out.
Speaking of redrawing the map, the prospect of a U.S. pullout from Syria is forcing friends and foes alike to scramble. Case in point, France, which up to now had a policy of not taking back nationals who'd gone to fight for ISIS. Not so anymore.
It goes without saying that if French nationals detained by the Kurds are going to be freed, expelled, then I believe it's in our collective interest to take control of their fate, rather than allowing them to be set free and having no idea where they are.
A sound policy, Alexis Poulain?
I think so. I mean, because of the withdrawal of the US troops, it changed everything. And the Kurds will be very busy with the Turks coming in the coming weeks. So you can't have all these French jihadists released or fleeing in the desert and trying to come back by their own way. I think it's best to have them judge here in France, in the jury system, and make sure that we also get the intelligence from them, what they've done there, who do they know, and they have a proper fair trial. Problem is, can we get the evidence of what they've done there? Will we get the right trials? Will they be jailed or will they get out? It's a big issue there, but you also have women and kids, and it's all about the issue of what you do of these people. Can they be de-radicalized and stop thinking about fighting in France?
France 24's team in eastern Syria covering the fight for that last tiny patch held by ISIS holdouts spoke to one woman who claims to hail from the French city of Tours in the center of the country.
C'est soit vous partez et vous êtes à peu près sûr de finir en prison, soit vous restez et vous êtes à peu près sûr de mourir. Donc il y en a qui ont fait moi j'ai fait le choix d'aller en prison, il y en a qui ont fait le choix de mourir. Ceux qui veulent retourner en France, c'est pas pour commettre des attentats, c'est pas pour aller tuer je sais pas qui dans un supermarché. Nous si on veut rentrer, c'est pour essayer de retrouver une vie normale.
My understanding is that most of the actual French fighters starting last year, the French special forces began an operation in northeast Syria when the U.S. And the Kurdish forces were really active against ISIS.
In 2017, the Wall Street Journal reported that the French hired guns in Iraq to go and summarily kill,
to take an inventory of French nationals that were fighting there. So my understanding, and the French special forces are pretty effective. So I would conclude that most of the high value targets have been taken care of. And that really the detainees that they're talking about are women and children and maybe people who weren't necessarily part of the fighting force, but were maybe in subsidiary roles, things like that, or don't have a lot of intelligence value. And they were really happy to leave them there with the Kurds until it became clear that it would become a humanitarian question, because the Kurds could have released them, they could have killed them, they could have done a lot of things that these are not combatants. So that would actually be a crime of war and a crime against humanity if you allow your nationals to be, especially children and women who weren't fighting, to be killed. So it became a different problem when the U.S. decided to pull out, because the French are dependent on the U.S. logistically.
But let's not forget, the women who went have committed a crime in going to the war zone, so they will be tried for that. And there's the issue of the children. If they were born over there, they're not guilty of going. How can we prove that they were involved in a crime? But on the other hand, as has been said by officials, it's a ticking time bomb. They've grown up only knowing war and hatred for the West. What do you do with them? Put them in detention centres, make sure they're de-radicalised. Legally, what can you do with them? But it's certainly an issue that worries a lot of officials here, and a lot of the public prosecutor's office was very concerned about that.
And there's been a bit of political one-upmanship. We've seen, especially from conservative MPs in the French parliament, one of them stating that basically there's a choice between strip them of their citizenship, Marc Basset's, or, quote, eliminate these people.
I think that there is some difficulty in some part of the French political society of understanding that they are French, to assume that these people are French citizens, just like all these parliamentarians.
And by the way, the woman we heard there, who claims she did not commit any crimes, by the way, she speaks with a flawless French accent.
Yes. She's you said she's from Tours, the center of France. So there is no more Frenchness than this woman. And France must assume, and I think it is in fact assuming, even if there have been some voices criticizing this possible decision, that they are French. They must be tried by a French court, and that's where they belong, probably.
The problem doesn't end there, though, because we ran an in-depth article last year about Belgium's experience with imprisoning returning fighters. There's the problem of radicalization within prison, of them becoming vectors by which to spread radicalization, and also this question of not having any evidence of what they did, or not really being able to determine. So there's a number of different problems in terms of sequencing, and the problems don't go away just with a trial.
No, that's clear. And that's why in the US you had Guantanamo. It was a sort of a SAS before actually judging, knowing who they are. In France, we don't have exception rule, so they will go into normal jail. And there is this problem, of course.
We talk about the scramble for Syria and how political balances are shifting. Thousands of Iranians this Friday packing the mausoleum of the Islamic Republic's founder. It's the 40th anniversary of the return of Ayatollah Khomeini to Tehran from exile in France. His return after 14 years in 1979 would signal the fall of the pro-Western Shah of Iran. The Iranian Revolution would not... it was definitely a watershed a moment. It would not only change Iran, but the entire region. And when you see at this point in time, Elaine Cobb, the United States announcing this sudden pullout, the fact that you have this kind of scramble for Syria unfolding, could we be witnessing another one of these moments when there could be this kind of seminal change in the balance of power in the Mideast?
I think it's a little early to say that, but it's not impossible. However, the US is its current policy often being dictated by Donald Trump's personal ideas on places, and he has a bee in his bonnet about Iran. He's determined that Iran has nuclear weapons and is hugely dangerous, whereas other nations, particularly in Europe, are saying we'd like to continue with the sanctions because we feel that the sanctions program works, and we're not convinced about changing it that way. But there's been a lot of shifting, and I think the accession to power in the US of President Trump has also allowed that, in that Israel has been given a much freer rein to do what it wants with the Palestinians, which leads to a lot of resentment in neighbouring countries. So I think there is a lot of shifting happening in the region, but too early to say exactly where it's all going.
When it comes to Iran, it's 40 years later, and we're seeing these competing forces, right? We have on the one hand the US, where Donald Trump basically said that his own intelligence services were a little naive. I think that was the word he used. And at the same time, the EU trying to forge its own path by trying to bypass US sanctions when it comes to that nuclear treaty.
But I think that the nuclear treaty without the US will be very difficult to be kept alive, or at least the way it was thought when it was approved in Vienna.
So we know Khomeini changed Iran for good. Has he changed the region forever?
As a journalist, I have to say that we use too much the term historic. I myself do it. Every week we have a couple or three of historic events. This was really a historic event 40 years ago, because we are living in a world, or the Middle East is living in the world created by this Iranian revolution in terms of oil, of the rise of Islamism. I'm not an expert in this area, but we can say a lot of things that come from this moment. And in the last 15 years after 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq, Iran has played an important role in relation to the policies of the United States in Iraq, in Syria.
You point the problem here is that Iraq was actually the power here to counterbalance Iran, and with the two Iraq wars, this is gone. Iraq is a very weak country so far, and Iran actually has the full power in the region, and that's where we have the problem. And with the Russian helping, the Hezbollah and all the region, I think it's all down to this.
At the same time, the Iranian economy is in near meltdown at this point. They're overextended. I think when in answer to your question, I think that the Middle East is at a historic moment where things are going to change. But I think that what appears on the surface is not necessarily what's going on underneath. It's like an iceberg. And I think Iran, depending on which day of the week or how you look at it, they can look like they're dominating the Middle East. They can also look like a regime on the verge of collapse. And the same could be said for a handful of other countries in the region. One thing I'd say.
So journalists are like economists. We're good at predicting the past.
It's the easiest prediction to make.
All right. We'll leave it there. I want to thank you, Judah Grunstein. I want to thank as well Marc Bassets, Alexis Poulain, Alain Cobb. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Haxie Myers-Belkin.
Hello, Francois. So it has, of course, been a very busy week for Venezuela, for Brexit, but it's also been a truly extraordinary week for the weather. A polar vortex swept across much of the US's Midwest, bringing with it temperatures as low as 49 degrees Celsius below zero. Now, temperatures are going to rise again over the weekend, but social media is very much awash with photos of the Chicago River frozen over. We've also been seeing a lot of pictures of Lake Michigan covered in a rather eerie fog there. Amateur photographers have been having a bit of a field day, unsurprisingly. Now, while this cold spell is absolutely mesmerising, it's also extremely dangerous. And no group is more at risk than the homeless. 80,000 people homeless in the city of Chicago alone. Now, social media has been extremely useful in alerting people to their plight, but also for highlighting acts of kindness. Time magazine's reporting that an anonymous Good Samaritan has paid for 70 homeless people to sleep in a hotel during the worst of the weather after they were evicted from a homeless shelter after a propane heater they were using exploded. They were then evicted from that shelter. Now, in Cleveland, meanwhile, an initiative called the Wall of Love is growing by the day. People are taking essentials like jumpers, scarves, woolly hats and attaching them to a wall, the idea being that people who need them simply go along and take the items that they need. The only request for this service being that people repay the favour when and if they're in a position to do so. Now, it's not just the homeless who need looking out for in this extreme weather. One pharmacist in Michigan has enlisted the help of her teenage son and a snowmobile, as you can see there, to make sure that people who are snowed in their homes get the emergency prescriptions they need. Now, freezing cold weather has led to innumerable acts of kindness, as you saw there. It's also led to a whole load of wonderment. People have worked out that if you blow bubbles in these sub-zero temperatures, they actually turn into these kind of spooky spheres of light. There's also a little video here that shows the kind of beautiful ice crystals that form on bubbles when they're blown in these temperatures. Now, the weather is so unusual that people in the Midwest are being subjected to a number of natural phenomena that most people just don't experience very often. This girl clearly has had some fun washing her hair, not drying it, and heading out into the snow. Now, people in Chicago have also been reporting that they've been hearing a series of very loud, booming sounds. Now, obviously, very alarming for those people encountering them. But we've been seeing a lot of articles online trying to explain exactly what this phenomenon consists of. This article, for example, in USA Today, explaining that such a rapid drop in temperature leads to a very quick freeze, meaning that rather than slowly expanding when ice crystals form, soil and rock actually bursts, and that's what causes these rather perturbing
So what you're saying is there's going to be a lot of potholes in Illinois coming
a
this
lot
spring.
of potholes and, slightly alarming sounds and fissures in the road. Now, moving away now from the US to Canada, a bear etched into the snow in Montreal is causing some significant consternation. Why, I hear you cry? Well, if you take a look at its belly button, that belly button is 2 meters away from each side, and people are wondering how the hell it got there because we can't see any foot traces in the snow. Now, there are a number of theories here. One person, a number of people have posited that this is actually the work of a drone, people using a drone to maybe drop something into the middle of that bare outline. Other people saying that no, drones, batteries in drones simply can't last that long in temperatures that low. Another popular theory is that it was in fact the belly button that came first, possibly the work of a fallen bird. There's a number of theories about it, but as of yet, we still don't know. The artist or artists haven't actually come forward. Now, to the UK now. It's slightly interesting. The US and Canada, of course, were colder than Antarctica, but the UK too on Thursday was being warned of extremely heavy snowfall.
Yeah, I saw there was a hashtag trending Snowmageddon or whatever.
Snowmageddon, absolutely.
Snowmageddon, excuse me.
Now, some parts of the country were indeed covered in some snowfall, but for many others, the experience was a little underwhelming, to say the least. One Twitter user saying, horrific commute this morning. Our train was 4 minutes late into Waterloo. We had to eat the weakest passenger on the train and drink from the toilet. Hashtag Snowmageddon. Jay Rayner, the restaurant critic for The Guardian, also embracing that traditionally British sardonic humour. When a snow event like last night's hits, one can only wonder at the majesty of natural forces in full throaty roar. Human civilization may well survive this, but for now we should look upon this weather cataclysm and feel only humble, Francois.
Brexit or no Brexit, they're keeping their sense of humour. That's great.
We try.
Axie Myers-Belkin, I want to thank you. I want to thank our panel. Thank you for joining us here in The World This Week.